So I think everybody here knows the extent to some of the epidemic proportions that we're seeing overdoses. This is a really nice graphic from the New York Times just showing the growth of the opioid epidemic as an example. What I thought we could do is start really if we can understand for ourselves how addiction forms, I think this will help us help ourselves and help others. So I thought we could start warming up with why Facebook's like heroin, how McDonald's has become so successful, how Lolo Jones could have won the Olympic gold medal, and how we can all become a Buddha in 9 minutes. So that's a little tongue-in-cheek, but I'd really like to jump in and see how much we can really understand this learning process for ourselves. So many of you may have seen videos like this. Yeah. So I think this is really helpful. How have we become so addicted to our technology that we're falling in pools, falling off piers, and doing all of this stuff? So I took this picture back in 2014 when the selfie stick was considered one of Time Magazine's top 25 inventions of the year. So this is a picture at the Louvre, and the reason I took this was because if you can see this guy here in the foreground, guess who this is? So this is the boyfriend now rendered obsolete. But I think this is really an interesting phenomenon. So we can imagine we're at the Louvre, maybe it's our first time there on vacation, we're really excited. That was actually, for me, the case. And so our brain says, this is great, let's make this continue. And so it says, well, why don't you take a picture to commemorate this? And then it says, no, I have a better idea. Why don't you post this on Facebook? So how do we spend the rest of our day at the Louvre? Are we looking at the famous artwork? No, what are we doing? Checking to see how many likes we got on our Facebook picture. Of course, the French always do this, they do this in style. But there's actually neurobiology behind this. So there was a group at Harvard that actually gave people the choice to either talk about themselves or earned money. Guess what they chose to do? And when they talked about themselves, they activated a brain region called the Nucleus Accumbens, which is the same brain region that gets activated when we use heroin, when we smoke crack cocaine, when we use alcohol, when we smoke cigarettes. Any drug of abuse has been shown to activate this brain region. There's a second study that showed that you could actually predict the amount of time that people spent on Facebook based on how much their nucleus accumbens got activated. So there's something rewarding about talking about ourselves. Now, it's interesting, John already mentioned that there may be a learning deficit in people with addictions. This is a meta-analysis that just came out. It's very interesting because we can see with reward anticipation, the nucleus accumbens is deficient in activation. So the argument is that there's something where we're deficient in learning, and that gets overactivated when we receive reward. So you can see people with addictions, their nucleus accumbens lights up like a Christmas tree when they receive a reward, when in many other normal individuals that would be tamped down. It wouldn't be as activated. So this reward deficiency, this learning deficiency may have real biological underpinnings. And that's important to know. Now, if we bring this back to how this relates to ourselves, this was a study with adolescents showing them their own Instagram feeds, and the only thing that was manipulated was the number of likes that they got. And what this group found was not only was the nucleus accumbens activated, but there were self-referential brain regions, in particular the posterior cingulate cortex, that also got co-activated. So there is, well, basically, we can sum it up this way. There's something that's rewarding that's related to ourselves. That's important to know because not only in substance abuse disorders, but also in some now call this Facebook addiction disorder, where if we learn that we feel good, those 4 things that Naida talked about, we do things to feel good, we do things to feel better. Well, if our brain learns, if I post pictures on Facebook, I feel good because there's this excitement that comes with getting the likes. Why don't I just go on Facebook when I feel bad? It's it's just the way that our brains work. Of course, it doesn't work so well. It leads to negative outcomes because going on Facebook when we're getting yelled at by our boss doesn't actually get our work done. And there's actually a linear relationship that some have found between social media use and the odds ratio of becoming depressed. You can see this on the right side here. It's very, very striking. So we can ask ourselves, okay, if this is happening, what's the mechanism behind this? And it's interesting, the Buddhist psychologists about 2,500 years ago actually described this process. So they said that a cue comes into our mind. Back then they thought the mind was somewhere in the guts and the liver. And they said, okay, it's either interpreted as pleasant or unpleasant. So if it's pleasant, we want it to continue, right? We want good things to happen. If it's unpleasant, like the NIDA data show, we want to feel better. So we have that urge for the unpleasantness to go away. And so we have this urge to do something. And so we behave accordingly. And then the way they described this was the birth of a sense of self, where we become identified with that behavior. The more we do something, the more we are that person. So, for example, with alcoholism, we become self-identified with, oh yeah, I'm an alcoholic. Now, it's interesting, the Buddhist psychologists described this. They said, this is perpetuated through a process that they called ignorance. And I'm using glasses here because in modern-day psychology, we call this subjective bias. And what that means is through this learning process, we become subjectively biased toward our world. We start to see the world through, oh yeah, I eat cupcakes when I'm sad glasses, or I drink alcohol when I'm frustrated glasses. And the more we do that, the more the process gets perpetuated. It's also interesting, they used a term for this loop. They called it samsara, which means endless wandering. Why? Well, we can see this. Drinking alcohol, eating cupcakes, smoking cigarettes doesn't fix the core root of the problem. If it's anxiety, it's depression, it's whatever, it just perpetuates it. So we start spinning our wheels. And again, they really emphasize this identification with these processes is perpetuating them. Now, Alan Watts, a modern-day philosopher, described it this way. He said, the ego, the self which he believed himself to be, is nothing but a pattern of habits. So he's really describing this self-identification. Now, if we break it down to its simplest terms, we can think of this as a habit loop. So we get a trigger, and we do some behavior, so we get stressed out, we eat cupcakes, and then we feel better. And this perpetuates the process. Now I'm going to show you a 1-minute Weight Watchers commercial.
If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're happy and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're happy and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sad because you're angry, feeling down, or generally bad, if you're sad, eat a snack. If you're bored and you know it, eat a snack. If you're lonely and you know it, eat a snack. If you're sleepy and you know it, if you're guilty and you know it, if you're stressed, eat a snack. If you're human and you know it, then your face will surely show it. If you're human, eat your feelings, eat a snack.
Boom. So how many of you have seen this commercial? Yeah, very few. Somebody actually sent this to me, and when I talked to the folks at Weight Watchers, I said, you nailed it. This is a habit loop. So why aren't you showing this commercial? And the woman sheepishly said, oh, it makes people depressed. Because just having the points system, which I think Weight Watchers uses, isn't going to fix the problem. So that's really interesting. And this problem is, so if we use a fancier diagram of this is operant conditioning. This is positive and negative reinforcement. This has been known for hundreds of years. Eric Kandel got the Nobel Prize showing that this is evolutionarily conserved all the way back to the sea slug. And as John mentioned, these people, places, and things, if we can understand mechanistically what's going on, we can actually start to affect the process because we can affect mechanistically. We can avoid these people, places, and things. With smoking, for example, it's a little harder to smoke to avoid our front porch, our car outside of work, and so we provide substitute strategies. So again, we might start exercising or we might do other things. Which can certainly help recovery. The problem sometimes here is, like with smoking, for example, the average weight gain is 15 pounds when people try to quit smoking. So there can be a lot of resistance to quitting, especially in women, because they're more concerned about gaining weight now than getting cancer later. Now, it's interesting, neither of these things actually targets that core craving itself. But if we go back to the Buddhist psychology, they said something very interesting, as I'm sure you can read this. They said, in the same way, if roots of craving are not wholly uprooted, sorrows will come again and again. Here's a modern day interpretation, but I think we all understand this. So craving is really something to pay attention to. And of course, there are some folks that are paying attention to this, and they're, I won't say what the societal outcome is, but Kellogg's, for example, has gotten into the fray. They have milk chocolate crave, and if milk chocolate crave isn't good enough, no worry, there's double chocolate crave. We know where this leads. And there was a very interesting expose in the New York Times that actually really highlighted this about how there are food engineers, where the tobacco companies bought the food companies because they know how addiction works. And now here we are basically, if you think of food this way, here we go. So, mechanism. It's really, really important to understand behavioral mechanisms, because if we can understand them, we can use them not only for good, but we can also use them for our own benefit. And sometimes, so I'll just leave it that way. So what now? If we can understand mechanistically what's going on, we can start to affect the process. And this is what we're really excited about. So for those of you that aren't familiar with standard definitions of mindfulness, Jon Kabat-Zinn coined this 35 years ago, paying attention in the present moment on purpose, non-judgmentally. Really, operationally, if we think about that habit loop, it's that push and pull. We want more of the pleasant. We want less of the unpleasant. If we can just be with those cravings, we can start to work with them. We can start to get a little more control. The way that we think of this is we drive this wedge of awareness in so that there's this stimulus and response, and instead of reactively or habitually reacting, we now have space to respond. That's the theory. But it seems kind of strange. How does paying attention actually help us do this? So in one of our studies, in our first smoking study, we actually had people come in. They were randomized. They didn't know what treatment they were getting. When they came to the mindfulness group, we said, okay, go ahead and smoke. And they looked at us like, is this the experiment? What's going on? We said, no, go ahead and smoke, but just pay attention as you do. And here's an example of what people start to notice. This woman said, smells like stinky cheese and tastes like chemicals. Yuck. Now, this is really, really critically important. John pointed out that the prefrontal cortex is important in this process. Well, the prefrontal cortex is the youngest part of the brain. It's the first part of the brain that goes offline when we get stressed out. So it's not that reliable. But if we drop back into our older evolutionary parts of our brain, we can say, oh, how does this feel? What is this actually, what do I get from this? Again, this is reward-based learning. Can we look at the rewards? So our brains start to recalibrate themselves. Oh, wow. And I've had people who smoked 40 years, and they're like, I can't believe I didn't notice this before. So they start to recalibrate their brains on their own simply by paying attention. Again, trigger reward-based learning, starting to tap into these rewards. I think Yogi Berra put it nicely. He says, you can observe a lot just by watching. Now, how well does this actually work? In our first study with alcohol and cocaine dependence, we found that mindfulness training was as good as gold standard treatment, in this case, cognitive behavioral therapy. We then said, okay, let's strip out any cognitive components and see if we can just deliver mindfulness training. And what we found with smoking was that we got twice the quit rates that maintained themselves, so that we had 5 times the quit rates of 5 times the quit rates at 4 months compared to gold standard treatment. This is the American Lung Association's freedom from smoking in this case. So there's something happening here. And this prompted us to say, okay, mechanistically, what's going on? And we went back to that operant conditioning model. And we said, okay, does this actually decouple craving and smoking? So we can think of, so we predict that just like a fire, so if craving's a fire, and every time we smoke a cigarette, we're fueling that fire. If we stop adding fuel to that fire's not going to suddenly go out on its own. It's going to burn down gradually. So we should still have cravings, but that shouldn't be coupled to smoking. I'm going to try not to bore you. I don't have any pictures of chairs, so I'm going to go through this table quickly. But basically what we find is a very strong correlation between craving and smoking at the beginning of treatment. This is completely gone at the end of treatment. And if we do the moderation equations, this has nothing to do with baseline craving, cigarette use, or end of treatment craving. It has everything to do with informal mindfulness practices. And really what these do is it's showing that we can actually have craving and not smoke. We have that space to pause. If you look at the raw data, because we can do all sorts of manipulations with statistics, you can see that there's the same level of craving at the end of treatment for the people that quit smoking. But over time, for the people that quit, their cravings die down, whereas the people that continue smoking, their cravings continue. So we're even seeing this in the raw data. If you bring this back to the model, we can see that this does seem to drive this wedge of awareness, moderating the decoupling of craving and behavior. This is really helpful to know because it does seem to really dive into that core part of the addictive loop. Now, when we found these results, we were really excited, but one of my colleagues at Yale was trying to disseminate cognitive behavioral therapy, and she was finding that it's really hard to get therapists to follow a manualized treatment. They're good at doing therapy, but not necessarily following a manual. So she started developing online-delivered cognitive behavioral therapy, and we said, well, let me look at my patients, and they're outside doing this. They have a cigarette in one hand, and what do they have in their other hand? Yes. So we said, well, can we actually deliver this at the point of contact? This is context-dependent learning. This is what our brains are set up for. Instead of delivering treatment in my office or in some artificial situation, can we actually deliver it where they're actually reinforcing that behavior? So we started developing app-based training so that we could test it. And what this looks like is we can cut our manualized treatment into bite-sized pieces. We can give them daily modules rather than once a week or twice a week training. We can deliver animations. I'll give you an example of this. And we can also embed experience sampling so we can study the efficacy of these treatments. We can also pair these with online communities because community support is really, really important. This is also some way that they can access expert resources as well as peers at any time. I'm just going to show you, this is a short video that shows how all of this is packaged together.
Welcome to Craving to Quit, a 3-week program that will help you quit smoking. This training, delivered live at Yale University, has been shown to be twice as effective as other quit smoking therapies. Now I'll walk you through the basic idea about how habits are formed. First, recognize that the wanting or craving is coming on and relax into it.
And we were very fortunate to work with a couple of animators who had actually both quit smoking using mindfulness training. So I'm going to show you an example of how we bring these trainings together in different ways to reinforce the concepts.
Today we're going to explain cravings through the metaphor of a screaming child. I know you've heard and seen a child throwing a tantrum. Perhaps for some of you, it was your own child. This child is screaming because he wants something. And you as the parent want him to stop screaming. All your child wants is a lollipop. So in this metaphor, think of your cravings as the child's tantrum. The lollipop is like the cigarettes. But what should you do? Yell at the child? That might make things worse. Gag the child? That will stop the screaming in the short term, but you know what will happen as soon as you take the gag away. You could just give him a lollipop. Congratulations! You just taught your child to scream for lollipops. In other words, you just taught him that screaming is a good way to get what he wants. What might you do instead? Here's a novel concept. Just let him scream himself out. What? Have you ever seen a child scream forever? Sometimes they scream so hard and so long that you think their head, or your head, might explode. But it never does. What happens instead? Eventually, the child gets tired and stops.
So just a way that we can convey some of these concepts, because mindfulness is simple but not necessarily easy to practice, especially if we're used to kind of forcing our way through life. Now, something that was very interesting for us was that some of our pilot testers were reporting that they were changing their eating behaviors based on reading our scripts for this program, and that was a big eye-opener for us because typically people start eating more, and these folks were actually doing something different. So that really gave us the idea to start looking at this reward-based learning process to see, oh, this is actually evolutionarily conserved all the way back to eating. So that's when we understood this process. And I'll just give an example. A woman in my clinic came in with binge eating disorder. She had actually started becoming emotionally abused by her mom at the age of 8, and she had started eating as a way that she described to numb her feelings. And really what she was describing was that there's this hole in her heart that she was trying to fill. By the time she came to me, she was morbidly obese, was binge eating on entire large pizzas 20 out of 30 days a month. So we said, okay, can we actually develop a program similar to the Craving Equip program where we can give this same type of training? So I'm not going to go through this because you get the general idea. But it's interesting, the folks in our program are starting to report that they're actually paying attention to this reward-based learning loop. This person said, I understand why I go for food to avoid or cover up or distract from uncomfortable feelings such as anger, sadness, or restlessness. Who wants to feel those things? Trigger, uncomfortable feeling. Behavior, eat something that temporarily diminishes the feeling. Reward, still have to deal with the unpleasant feelings, plus the sugar headache. So you can get the sense that we're really training them to see their own habits very, very clearly. And I'm happy to report that one of my collaborators at UCSF just finished a study with this program where she got a 40% reduction in craving-related eating within 3 months. So we can see that even with, this is just the beginning of our first pilot study, but we can see that people are actually engaged in these programs and they can actually change their behavior this way. I'll just give an example. Somebody said a shift is happening. I'm choosing more healthy foods. The sugary things are less attractive. So again, just tapping into this same reward-based learning process and hacking it so that we can learn how unhelpful the unhealthy habits are and start to see that, oh, actually eating healthily feels pretty good. So now I'm going to shift to talking about neurobiologic mechanisms now that we've unpacked a little bit about the behavioral mechanisms and how we can start to affect change through mobile health. So for many of you know who Lolo Jones is. She's an Olympic hurdler. She was favored to win the Olympic gold medal in the 2008 Olympics in Beijing. And in fact, she was in the finals, in the lead at the 9th of 10 hurdles. I'm going to read you an interview she had with Time magazine. She said, I was just in an amazing rhythm, and then I knew at one point I was winning the race. It wasn't like, oh, I'm winning the Olympic gold medal. It just seemed like another race. And then there was a point after that where I was telling myself to make sure my legs were snapping out, so I overtried. That's when I hit the hurdle. So the point here is that she got caught up in her thinking. It's not that one of the major misconceptions about mindfulness is, it's about helping us stop our thoughts or, become some bliss mobile. The idea here is just to change our relationship to our thoughts and to our emotions and to our body sensations simply through paying attention to them. I think this puts it nicely. We get in our own way by trying to fix things, and in fact, bringing awareness to these might tap into the process so that they can fix themselves. Now, how much do we get in our own way? There was a study at Harvard in 2010 that showed that we spend about 50% of waking life daydreaming, being lost in the past, in the future. And if we think of that as getting caught up in our experience, there's this continuum where we can snap out of that. Now, if we're stressed, boy, it would be great. Hey, snap out of it, and then we're not stressed anymore. So we can see that doesn't work. So with stress, we can see we're a little more caught up. And addiction is the far end of the spectrum, where we're continuous use despite adverse consequences. I really like that simple definition, where we know it's bad for us, we know it's ruining our relationships, yet we can't stop. So there's a level of caught upness that is way at the far end of the spectrum. Now, if this caught upness happens so often, at least 50% of waking life with daydreaming, we can measure this. And there was a group that defined what's now called the default mode network, which is a network of brain regions that gets activated when we are thinking about ourselves, when we're thinking about the past and future, when we're doing all sorts of self-referential things. Now, two of the main hubs of the default mode are the medial prefrontal cortex, shown in yellow here, and then the posterior cingulate cortex. Just to remind you, the posterior cingulate cortex is that self-referential brain region that gets activated in teenagers that get more likes on their Instagram feeds. Now, it's interesting, this same brain region gets activated when people with cocaine dependence are viewing cocaine videos, people smoking crack cocaine. It lights up like a Christmas tree when smokers are viewing pictures of people smoking. It gets activated when people who have gambling addiction are viewing scenes of gambling. So we can see this over and over and over in different types of addictions. I'm just going to list a bunch of different studies that have shown activation in the posterior cingulate cortex. And of course, craving here is my favorite at the end. So how do all of these fit together? One working hypothesis is that the posterior cingulate's involved in an experiential self. When we get caught up in experience, that tells us, oh, this is me and this is the rest of the world, that literal clenching feeling. And we can even drop into our own experience right now. What's it feel like when we feel fear? Does it feel contracted or does it feel expanded? Contracted, yeah. And there's actually a study that had people draw in pictures, where do you feel these emotions most? So for example, fear, right here. How many of you can relate to this? Yeah. How about anger? How about anxiety? How about sadness? We can see that there's this core here, and these are all reasons that my patients come in and report, oh, I used because I was afraid. I used because I was angry. I used because I was anxious. I used because I was sad. So we can see this caught upness can be a trigger for people to relapse. Now, so where does mindfulness training come into this? Well, the idea here is that it can help us get out of our own way and not get caught up in ourselves. Now, I don't have time to go through the data, but basically, we did our first cross-sectional study with experienced versus novice meditators. We looked across a bunch of different types of meditation, and we said, what's common here? And the first thing we found was a non-finding, which was there was nothing that was increased in activity in their brains compared to novices, which was striking to us. We were expecting to find that brain region that got activated when we're meditating. But in fact, we found that these two main hubs of the default mode network are deactivated. That's what blue shows here, deactivated in experienced meditators. So they're actually, getting deactivation in this brain region. Now, in the posterior cingulate in particular. Now, when we published these data, they were kind of different than what other people had found, so we wanted to make sure we weren't fooling ourselves. And so we turned to a technique that one of my colleagues at Yale had developed, real-time neurofeedback, where we can actually have people meditate while we're giving them feedback from their own brains in real time. And we started this with fMRI, and then we are now doing this with EEG neurofeedback. We can also do a bunch of control experiments, which I'm not going to show you today. We've published these data. But I'll just show you an example of how this works. We had somebody come into our lab and donate his brain. You might recognize him. This is just the next generation of exercise. We've got the physical exercise components down, and now it's about working out how can we actually train our minds.
Dr. Brewer is trying to understand how mindfulness can alter the functioning of the brain. He uses a cap lined with 128 electrodes.
We're going to start filling each of these 128 wells with conduction gel.
The electrodes are able to pick up signals from the posterior cingulate, part of a brain network linked to memory and emotion.
This is all just picking up electrical signal from the top of your head.
Since attending the mindfulness retreat, I'd been meditating daily and was curious to see if it had an impact on my brain.
We're going to have you start with thinking of something that was very anxiety-provoking for you.
Okay.
When I thought about something stressful, the cells in my brain's posterior cingulate immediately started firing, shown by the red lines that went off the chart on the computer screen.
Just drop into meditation.
Okay.
When I let go of those stressful thoughts and refocused on my breath, within seconds, the brain cells that had been firing quieted down, shown by the blue lines on the computer.
That's really fascinating to see like that.
Dr. Brewer believes everyone can train their brains to reach that blue mindfulness zone, but he says all the technology we're surrounded by makes it difficult.
It's interesting, when Anderson came to the lab, we had no idea what was going to happen, but he had gone on a meditation retreat with John Kabat-Zinn a month before, and he came in and he's like, I had no idea that I actually could do this, because he had to get into the zone when he was in Iraq and in all these very dangerous places. And he didn't know that he could actually train himself to do this. So he's like, I get on a plane, I meditate. I get in a cab, I meditate. Like he was on fire. But for novices, we might start asking ourselves, a lot of the work that we've done was with experienced meditators. So we can say, are you kidding? I have to practice, like 10,000 hours to change my default mode. And I think this is where we can actually ask the question, and Vince Lombardi, for those of you that aren't familiar with him, the Super Bowl trophy is called the Lombardi Trophy, right? So it's named after this famous Green Bay Packers football coach, and he really talks about perfect practice. It's not just about doing something, it's doing something well so that we can learn it. So we can start asking ourselves, well, what do we actually need to develop good mindfulness practices or good mindfulness habits? So, of course, paying attention. Now, here's a novice meditator. Never learned to meditate before. We taught him that morning. He got in our fMRI scanner, and these are each 3-minute runs. You can see a lot of red. So he's activating his posterior cingulate cortex, and then suddenly brain transplant, right? No. So in this fourth run, something was very different, and he reported, oh, well, I noticed, it felt a lot more relaxed, like it was less of a struggle to prevent my mind from struggling. So instead of trying to force himself to pay attention to his breath, that was the mindfulness practice he was doing, he just let go and dropped in. He was actually describing what the ancient psychologists describe as the fifth factor of awakening, a passaddhi, which literally translated is relaxation or tranquility. Here's an experienced meditator who said, I focused on the feeling of interest, wonder, and joy that arises with mindful breathing. What he was describing was the second factor of awakening. So curiosity, being interested. Instead of forcing something, just dropping in and getting curious and letting that curiosity bring us in. You could see the differences in his brain. Here's another novice who said, I was thinking about my breath. I don't think your neurofeedback thing works because it went red. And he was kind of like, yeah, you fancy Yale scientist, you don't know what you're doing. Very next run, boom. I focused more on the physical sensation instead of thinking in and out. So instead of trying, just like Lolo Jones was doing, instead of getting caught up in the thinking, he just dropped into his body, these physical sensations, which, boy, I wish I had neurofeedback when I was first starting to meditate, because this is something that can be very, very hard to teach as we get stuck in our conceptual minds instead of dropping into our actual experience. So, you think of this as, we learn to drop ourselves. So I'm actually, so we have plenty of time, so I'm just going to finish by saying, let's bring all of this together. We talked about understanding the behavioral mechanisms of how we learn. If we can understand that, we can actually tap into and hack this process. So if we think of a trigger being stress, and that behavior is any type of use, whether it's eating cupcakes or smoking cigarettes or taking pills or shooting heroin, and that temporary reward that comes from it is helping us feel a little bit better. If we start to pay attention to that reward and all the consequences that come from that, what do I actually get from this? This cigarette doesn't taste so good. That sixth cupcake, my gut does not feel so good right now. We can actually hack this process. Behaviorally, we can hack this, and then we can also understand neurobiologically what's going on so that we can develop treatments and feedback mentalities. Again, that's a little down the road, but we can help provide this mental mirror so we can really see clearly the difference between these excited, these clenched rewards that we get versus those that feel different and might even, if we think of this as a Skinner box, might actually give us a different type of reward, one that's not based on getting something, but is moved more internally where we can tap into it in any moment. For example, curiosity. Here's an example from somebody in our smoking program. He said, I'm able to somehow write out the cravings pretty quickly. I think of it as a kind of new habit loop. I go from wanting a smoke to either automatically recalling the bad sensations or automatically connecting the cigarette with more fuel for my addiction. Here's somebody in the eating program. She said, what's most interesting to me is how we define the rewards. In the past, the reward of eating right had been weight loss, but it was more often than not short-lived because I hadn't made real process change in my daily life. She's also describing an external reward. If I step on the scale and it goes in the right direction, I feel good. She said, here it feels like the reward is defined differently and weight loss is a side effect. The reward here is for a lack of a better expression or more balanced life or inner peace. So just to finish this, my patient who came in describing binge eating 20 out of 30 days, she came to our group-based treatment on a weekly basis in my addiction clinic and started to recalibrate her brain. After she was in the program for about a year, and I saw her a year later, and she had lost 40 pounds. She was exercising regularly. But what was most important was she said, I got my life back. I can eat a single piece of pizza now and actually enjoy it. So I'm just going to seed a discussion, and maybe we have a minute to talk about this a little bit. But what we're starting to do now is play with flipped classroom models. So if you aren't familiar with a flipped classroom, in higher education and colleges in particular, they're playing with this new model of education where lectures typically delivered in class and homework's done at home. They flip this where they record their lectures, and students can watch them at home. They can sit in their pajamas. They can watch them whenever they want. They can watch them however many times they want. And these can be embedded with multimedia, et cetera. And then the students do their problem sets in class. So I have a friend who teaches physics out in California. And his students come to class and do he's available for them to answer questions as they do their problem sets because he doesn't have lecture time anymore. So we're starting to play with this at the Center for Mindfulness, where we have a weekly program where they learn the didactic training at home through an app, and then they come together each week. They bring their homework to class, which is their life. And that's something I think that we're exploring more. I think that the world will explore more as well as we start to learn how to incorporate media and all of the other rich learning modalities into higher education, as well as into addiction treatment. So I will stop there. I think we have plenty of time. I just want to acknowledge all the folks that contributed to this work, in particular the folks that literally donated their brains to help with this, as well as our funders. The NIH is the primary funder for the work that we've been doing, also the VA hospital when I was working at the VA Center in New Haven, Connecticut. And now, just to do something completely self-referential, I'll mention that I went through a lot of this really quickly, but all of it is unpacked in more detail in this book that just came out. Great, thank you.